The Honourable Member for Regina Wascana.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to have the opportunity tonight to speak to the budget. A big part of what politicians do is decide which problems in society need to be solved by governments and which problems are best left to individuals and to families and to the private sector. And this Liberal government, with their NDP coalition partners, spends a great deal of time and effort and energy and taxpayers' money trying to solve all sorts of problems, while unfortunately accomplishing very little and more often than not being counterproductive. I remember when the Finance Minister presented her budget last month, she received one partial standing ovation from the official opposition when she said, quote, "Mr. Speaker, there are those who claim that the only good thing that the government can do when it comes to economic growth is to get out of the way," unquote. The Finance Minister went on to cite the example of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project as an example of her government's success when it comes to government intervention in the economy. Madam Speaker, it wasn't too long ago that resource companies and international investors were excited about all of the potential pipeline projects in this country. Northern Gateway, Keystone XL, and Energy East, just to name a few. Building pipelines such as these is something that private sector companies are able to do in most countries, but sadly not in Canada. All of the blueprints for all of these pipeline projects have been sitting on the shelf collecting dust for years because this Liberal government has made it practically impossible for the private sector to get projects like this built through its anti-development legislation such as Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines Bill, and Bill C-48, the West Coast oil tanker ban. So it is sad that the Finance Minister would cite as a success story the one lonely, solitary pipeline expansion project that the government decided to take over while all the others were being chased away. It's also worth noting that this was not a new pipeline being built. It was simply the twinning of an existing pipeline with a new pipe being laid right alongside the old one. This raises the question, how long did it take to build the new pipeline, and how long did it take to build the old one? The proposal for the original Trans Mountain Pipeline was submitted for approval in 1951.
Oh my God.
Construction was finished in 1952. Compare that, Madam Speaker, to the decade that it has taken for the expansion to be completed. That makes this project hardly anything for this Liberal government to brag about.
That's right.
One also cannot help but be concerned about the cost overruns that have happened under this Liberal government's watch.
Yep.
The Trans Mountain expansion was originally estimated to cost $7 billion. The final price came in at $34 billion.
Wow. Surprise.
When a five-fold increase in total cost is touted as a success story, that should give all Canadians pause the next time this Liberal government sets out on one of its interventions into the economy. The Finance Minister went on to talk about her government's new school lunch program. It seems that the Liberals have just recently discovered what Conservatives and food banks have been saying for years. Namely, food bank use has skyrocketed under the Liberal government. According to a report by Food Banks Canada, nearly 2 million Canadians had to use food banks in March of last year. That's a 32% increase from the year before. Furthermore, 1/3 of food bank users are children. I didn't hear the Finance Minister mention under whose watch food bank use skyrocketed. I didn't hear anything in her speech about the Liberals increasing their carbon tax again this year on the farmers who grow the food, and the truckers who truck the food, and the grocers who refrigerate the food, and all of those costs being passed on to consumers at the grocery store. I also didn't hear anything from the Finance Minister about passing Bill C-234 in its original form to exempt grain drying and barn heating from the carbon tax so that those costs are not passed on to consumers in the form of higher grocery prices. I didn't hear anything about the Liberals' $40 billion deficit driving up interest rates, or the $60 billion in debt servicing charges, making it more difficult for Canadians to make ends meet, and causing Canadians to have to choose between putting a roof over their heads or putting food onto the dinner tables. Instead of focusing on the root cause of the cost of living crisis, the Liberals have decided to bring in yet another government program, this time a nationwide school lunch program. And while school lunch programs are certainly a reasonable and beneficial public policy, anyone who bothers to take a brief skim of sections 91 and 92 of our Constitution will tell you that this is clearly the jurisdiction of provincial governments and best left to provincial ministries of education and social services. Madam Speaker, what I find so frustrating about this Liberal government is not only are they bad at capitalism, they are also just as bad at socialism. Take, for example, the new Canada Disability Benefit. This program resulted from the passage of Bill C-22, a bill that the Liberals introduced almost 2 years ago. The stated objective of this bill was actually very reasonable: to provide a social safety net for Canadians living with disabilities so that no one has to live in poverty due to a disability. Personally, I've always felt that programs such as this are best left to provincial governments. In my home province of Saskatchewan, we have a program called the Saskatchewan Assured Income for Disability Program, or SAID for short. But I also believe very strongly in being an inclusive society for persons with disabilities. So if the federal government wanted to join in, I certainly was not going to stand in the way. It seems that everyone else in this chamber felt the same way since Bill C-22 passed unanimously last year. So when the details of the Canada Disability Benefit were announced in the budget, they were certainly a disappointment for disability advocates everywhere, the maximum benefit being only $200 per month, and not one thin dime will be paid out until July of next year. Madam Speaker, $200 per month is not enough for anyone in this country to live off of, not even before inflation and the cost of living skyrocketed under this government. Madam Speaker, after 9 years of this Liberal government, and with the introduction of this budget, the size of the federal government and the cost of the federal government has now doubled under the Liberals' watch. After 9 years, this government has gotten to the point where literally all of the revenue from the GST goes towards merely paying the interest on the federal debt. The Liberals are adding another $40 billion to the federal debt this year, which now stands at well over $1 trillion and still rising. Madam Speaker, to come back to the Finance Minister's statement when she said the only good thing that the government can do when it comes to economic growth is to get out of the way. Madam Speaker, I think that a more accurate statement would be that the only good thing that this government can do is to get out of the way. It's time for a new Conservative government to replace the Liberals and their NDP coalition partners and to fix the budget as well as the many other problems that they have created. Therefore, Conservatives will vote against this budget, and we will vote non-confidence in this government. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Well done.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
So if I understand this correctly, Madam Speaker, Conservatives are saying that it's this government's fault that people have to use food banks. But when this government puts forward a solution to that, this member says it's not in the jurisdiction of the federal government. You should read our Constitution. The federal government should have nothing to do with this. The member spoke as though he was very complimentary and understood and encouraged school food programs. He must know that Canada is the only G7 country without a national school food program. But yet he not only will vote against this budget that puts money into it, he also voted against the National School Food Program policy that came before this House about 3 months ago. And we are here and expected to believe that this is all because the Constitution says we shouldn't do anything about it.
The Honourable Member for Regina Wascana.
Oh, good heavens, where to begin, Madam Speaker? Well, yes, this Liberal government has caused a lot of problems in this country, most notably the increased use of food bank, especially among children, over the last 9 years of this government. I would also just really encourage the member to read this country's constitution. I don't know what it's like in his home province of Ontario, but in Saskatchewan, every school can be designated as a community school if it is in a neighborhood with a low enough income and a low enough poverty level. And those schools are given school food programs on the basis of the individual need. I don't understand why we need a national school food program when provincial governments are already doing exactly that.
That's right.
Questions et commentaires? Questions and comments, the honourable member for Skeena Buckley Valley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My colleague from Regina mentioned the Northern Gateway Pipeline, and what he didn't mention was that the Northern Gateway Pipeline and the plan by Enbridge to bring crude oil supertankers to the north coast of BC was wholly rejected by municipalities, by First Nations, by anglers, by commercial fishermen, and by the majority of the people of the District of Kitimat who held a specific referendum on that issue. Now, the culmination of that effort led to Bill C-48, the North Coast Oil Tanker Moratorium Act. And I'm wondering, and I say this with no animus to my colleague personally, but his leader is going around the country saying that a Conservative government would tear up that oil tanker moratorium as one of its first acts in office. And I'm wondering if my friend down the way can confirm that is indeed true, and if he can say it loud enough for the people all the way on the west coast of Canada, on Haida Gwaii and in Prince Rupert and Clem II and all of the territory.
We get the gist of it. The honourable member for Regina Wascana.
I have said literally hundreds of times on the campaign trail that yes, Conservatives are opposed to Bill C-48, the West Coast oil tanker ban. That's because Canada's oil and gas don't do anyone any good when they just sit there in the ground doing nothing. And other countries around the world, they buy their oil and gas from Saudi Arabia and from Russia, and that is so counterproductive to building a productive Canadian society and a better world for our allies all around the world. So yes, we will certainly get oil and gas flowing to our allies and around the world. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Comments, the honourable member for Fort McMurray Cold Lake.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague from Regina Wascana for his wonderful speech. And him and I share a passion when it comes to supporting Canada's world-class energy industry. I'm just wondering if he could perhaps explain some of what he hears in Regina about how the impact of this anti-energy government has been on the people and the jobs in Regina Wascana.
The honourable member for Regina Wascana.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. I would like to thank her as well for all of her advocacy for Canada's oil and gas sector. Yes, so in my riding of Regina Wascana, it's not just the oil and gas workers who benefit from the natural resource sector. It's not just the steel workers at Evraz Steel north of Regina who make the pipelines who benefit from the oil and gas sector. In any given year, between 10 and 15% of the provincial government's revenue comes from natural resource royalties. That's how the provincial government can afford to build schools and hospitals and make our society a better place. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable